Hello, I'm Dr. Bang Jisung, the hair doctor who's here to protect your hair. It's great to see you. If you search on YouTube, you will find a lot of explanations from other pharmacists, but I'll briefly explain it from my perspective. From what I know, there are two types of hair loss medication. There's the original drug, and then there are the generic drugs that copy its active ingredient. Actually, calling it a hakopyu sounds a bit off, so we call them generic. It's also used to mean over-the-counter medicine. You can just think of it like a no-brand concept. So, I'll just call them original and a generics. The original is developed through research, its ingredients are created, and it gets approved after accumulating a lot of data. It's really the best drug. But these drugs are naturally more expensive, right? They're pricey, and while they have a lot of verified data, they're also covered by a patent. So these original drugs receive significant attention throughout their patent period. However, as soon as that patent expires, other pharmaceutical companies who have been closely monitoring them then produce similar medications by replicating the exact active ingredient of the original drug. Thus, patients frequently inquire, is the drug efficacy identical, or is it the exact same medicine? While this might seem like a play on words, it's quite clear they are not in fact the same drug. I mean, think about cars. They all have wheels and a steering wheel, but every brand is a different car, right? If you ask, are those all cars? Yes, they are cars, but each car is different. They differ by model and by company. It's the same with drugs. The active ingredient is the same, so the main effect might be the same. But are the drugs identical? No, they're not. So, how do we describe it scientifically? We say they are equivalent. That's a bit odd, isn't it? To put it simply, they essentially take the active ingredient, create a similar compound, and then, presuming the primary action will be alike, they assess it as virtually the same drug, judging its performance and efficacy as equivalent. However, here's where it falls short. Does making a drug mean it only contains the active ingredient? Apparently that's not the case. When making the medication, other ingredients called additives are included to create the drug's form. However, these additives differ from drug to drug. This essentially means that the mechanism by which the drug breaks down, or its potential side effects, could also vary. So, for patients who feel somewhat comfortable and relaxed, I usually let them take the medication they're most at ease with. However, for those who are genuinely sensitive, particular, and scrutinizing individuals, I generally tend to recommend the original drug. That's because the verified data and research paper results I'm referring to are predominantly associated with original drugs. However, a generic drug, though similar to the original's active ingredients, could potentially lead to different side effects or other adverse outcomes, and I simply cannot be aware of every single one of those possibilities. That's why we generally recommend the original drug as the safer option. You can certainly think of it that way. Well, I believe there could be a psychological difference, and it truly depends on which original drug you were initially taking and which generic you ultimately switch to. However, if the active ingredient remains the same, you likely won't perceive a significant difference between the original and the generic versions. From my perspective, there are two main scenarios: switching from a non-original drug to the original, and switching from the original to a generic. And what I've noticed, and this is my subjective opinion based on clinical experience, is that those who take the original tend to see a more stable recovery. That's personally my opinion. Other pharmacists or doctors watching this might disagree, saying, hey, that's incorrect. However, I advise my patients, if you're feeling uneasy, perhaps consider taking the original drug rather than a generic. That's typically my recommendation, and it aligns with my general prescribing practice. However, clinically speaking, there's currently no evidence showing one is demonstrably better or worse. Thus, it's difficult to make a definitive statement. Today, we've briefly looked at the differences between the original drug and the generic, or so-called copy drug. I know there's a lot of information out there. It would be good to do more research and make your own decision. Thank you.